Sure. So my name is James Whitehorne. I'm the chief of the Census Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office. So obviously that's my specialty is around the redistricting tabulations and the voting rights tabulations that the census produces. But by being sort of one of the end users of all this activity that you've heard of today and yesterday, we kind of have a good look when we're looking back at the organization to see how the data gets finalized after it's collected. So I'm going to talk about this in a very sort of general sense about the processes around a response once it's captured by the decennial census. This is going to be admittedly very high level, sort of simplified version of the process, but I'm hoping to give you the concepts and the names and acronyms that you're going to need to know to understand the road that a response takes as it goes through the census. I'm going to start by walking through the generalized flow that I have up here. And then we're going to revisit this at the end so you can see how the other topics that are in the discussion fit into this sort of diagram. So I'm starting here with the decennial response file. This is the raw data as it's captured. So when people fill out a response online and it makes it through our online system, it ends up in the decennial response file. When a file comes in from a paper form, it gets turned into an electronic response. It ends up in this decennial response file. The next is the census unedited file. We call this the CUF. This is the final census count of people in living quarters. This is the count that's used for apportionment. So when the CUF is finalized, we have the full population count that can be used to create the apportionment numbers. Then we have the census edited file, the CEF. This is where we take that census unedited file and we ensure that every response has valid values for the major characteristics that are asked about in the census. For the 2020 census, we now have this disclosure avoidance system. We've always had disclosure avoidance as a process, but now it's an actual system, part of the systems of the census. And we move that edited file into the disclosure avoidance system where we apply differential privacy to ensure the confidentiality of the census responses. And then finally, the output of the disclosure avoidance system is our micro detail file, which is a protected data which can be used by the tabulation system for producing products. So the use of internet response has opened up many avenues for census participation. A response can be provided electronically, directly from the respondent using the URL. It can be provided through a telephone operator at one of the Census Questionnaire Assistance Centers, or it can be submitted through an enumerator with a handheld device if that ends up being the capture method. The typical flow for an internet response will be for the user to access the URL. They provide their information, or they're directed to they're asked for the response ID, and then they're directed to the response input form. If they don't have the ID, it'll go through that non-response or real-time non-ID process that has been mentioned several times today. And then once that part is complete, then they go to the respondent input form. The internet response tool includes a series of error and validation checks, which are performed field by field as the respondent works through the form. And they're based on a series of established business rules that we've worked through at the Bureau. Once complete, that data is captured. If it's in English or Spanish, it goes directly into the response processing. And if it's in a language other than Spanish or English, it goes for translation, and then it gets moved to our response processing operation as well. Now, paper is still a very viable option for people to respond to the census. A paper response will typically come from areas with low internet access, people unlikely to respond by the internet, or areas that have been designated as an update leave area, which was also mentioned earlier today. Paper forms are returned by mail and they're sent to one of our decennial census processing centers. Then they're scanned using optical character recognition and manual keying if it's needed. And then they also end up in that decennial response file. So you can sort of see a theme here. Everything gets gathered, gets into that decennial response file until we have all the responses gathered. So the next stage of the process revolves around the concepts of editing and imputation. There are essentially two types of these actions. We have count imputation and we have characteristic editing and imputation. Count imputation is used to replace missing count information from housing units that have been identified and verified as being occupied. Count imputation is conducted during the construction of the CUF that I mentioned, the census unedited file. And the completed CUF provides us with those first official counts from the decennial census, the total population counts. And these are the counts that I mentioned are used for apportionment. Once the CUF is completed, the next stage is to create that census edited file. As part of creating the census edited file, edits and characteristic imputation are used to ensure that every record has a valid response for the person and housing responses in the census. It's important to understand the purpose of edits and characteristic imputation. The purpose is to ensure that every respondent has a valid response. The edits and character imputation do not add people to the census. As I mentioned earlier, the total population count is set with the census unedited file. What the edits do is they ensure consistency among characteristics, such as a person being identified as a parent, not being younger than a young child. The characteristic imputation ensures that each person and housing item has a valid response, such as an occupied housing unit without a tenure status, indicating whether it's rented or owned. And administrative records are used to improve the quality of this character imputation. There are different types of characteristic imputation. Assignment is when when responses are missing or inconsistent with other data supplied for that person or household, can be used to correct for that missing or inconsistent response. A simple example of this is when either the birth date or age is missing. The one you do have can be used to calculate the other. So that would be an example of an assignment. An allocation is when you have the same situation, but you cannot make a determination for the missing or inconsistent response based on that already supplied for the person or household data. And then in these cases, a response from another person within the housing unit or a nearby housing unit can be used. And then finally, we have a special case of allocation called substitution. And this is used when we know we have a person record, but all of the person characteristics for all of the person records in that housing unit have to be imputed. So now that you know what the three types of characteristic imputation are, you can break out the 2010 rates by type and by the characteristic. And you can see that they remain fairly small overall. So you have the imputed number, which is a combination of the assigned and the allocated, and then you have the substituted for the number of substituted persons. So to help conceptualize these edits and characteristic imputations, I have a few examples around age and date of birth. The first scenario is what I mentioned earlier. One of the two characteristics is provided and the other is not for age or date of birth. If age is reported but not the date of birth, we generate a random birth date for that reported age, one that would calculate out correctly. If it's the date of birth that was reported, then we can just calculate the age. If both the age and date of birth are reported but they're inconsistent by 2 or more years, then we use edits to determine which is more consistent with the other data reported. And we may need to edit an age for consistency, like the child-parent relationship from the previous slide that I mentioned. And then finally, if necessary, an allocation from a hot deck can be used. A hot deck assigns a missing value from a record with similar characteristics. The characteristics in a hot deck vary depending on the nature of the unanswered question. So that's sort of a matrix of several characteristics, and then you can identify what the missing characteristic is. Once all of this review and editing imputation are completed, and remember, a majority of the records need none of this work. It's a small percentage overall. Then we have a completed CEF. This is the full census record with characteristics. And this is what we can then move into our disclosure avoidance system. So the Census Bureau considers the protection of respondent data one of its highest charges. As employees, we swear to uphold Title 13. It's not just an oath, but it's a culture at the Census Bureau. To ensure we protect respondent data, the Census Bureau continuously works to improve the disclosure avoidance methods as science has changed. The 2000 and the 2010 censuses involved both two primary types of disclosure avoidance. The first being aggregation. We published aggregate statistics in the Public Law 94-171 file, the Summary File 1 file, and the Summary File 2 file. And just the act of aggregating data does provide some measure of protection of the individual responses. And the second mechanism was household level swapping. So you can see on this slide, there's advantages to household swapping. It's easy to understand. It can be run on a state-by-state basis. That's more important for internal processing reasons. The operation is invisible to the rest of census processing. It does have some disadvantages in that it does not consider or protect against a database reconstruction attack. Swap rates and details of swapping have to remain confidential. In order for that protection to hold, that information can't be shared. And then there's the privacy guarantee is based on a lack of external data. And as I mentioned, differential privacy, you'll see that why that's important. We don't talk much about the actual mechanism of swapping, and I've borrowed this from our disclosure avoidance folks. The official technical documentation for the publications that I mentioned earlier all contain the same paragraph, which I'll just read to you quickly. Data swapping is a method of disclosure avoidance designed to protect confidentiality in tables of frequency data, the number or percentage of the population with certain characteristics. Data swapping is done by editing the source data or exchanging records for a sample of cases. A sample of households is selected and matched on a set of selected key variables with households in neighboring geographic areas that have similar characteristics. Because the swap often occurs within a geographic area with a small population, there is no effect on the marginal totals for the geographic area with small population totals that include data from multiple geographic areas with small populations. Because of data swapping, users should not assume that the tables with cells have a value of 1 or 2 reveal information about specific individuals. Now for the 2020 census, we're modernizing and strengthening how we protect privacy in the statistics that we release. We're deploying differential privacy. This is the gold standard of privacy protection in computer science and cryptography. We're using this to preserve confidentiality in the 2020 census and beyond. Differential privacy was developed by researchers at Microsoft and is now used by many leading technological firms. And there's many different variations of this differential privacy. The one selected for the 2020 census introduces controlled noise into the data in a manner that preserves the accuracy of the data at higher levels of geography. This change was found to be needed because of the huge increase in personal information that's available online and from commercial providers, and the ever-increasing technology to manipulate that data, the increase in computer power and such things. So the advantages to differential privacy is that the privacy guarantees are tunable and provable, meaning that we can ensure the fitness of use of the data as it's produced after applying the differential privacy. They're future-proof, and the mathematical theorems show that the guarantees are future-proof. And the privacy guarantees are public and explainable. And I personally put an asterisk next to explainable because I've been sitting through differential privacy explanations for several years now, and I'm slowly getting a hold of the ideas behind it. But it is explainable. It just takes some background. It protects against database reconstruction. And then the disadvantages are an entire country must be processed at once for best accuracy. And then every use of private data must be tallied in the privacy loss budget. And these two concepts I'll kind of revisit when we get to data products because they're important to that. Because basically the second line there is saying we have to know all the data we're going to produce from the 2020 census before we apply the protections. So in short, the disclosure avoidance system assumes that the 2020 census data products will meet the legal requirements of Title 13, Section 9. That's our privacy protections. It's designed to prevent improper disclosure about individuals and establishments and all stakeholders. Anyone who uses 2020 census data will be affected through this. So once the disclosure avoidance system has completed its work, we can then tabulate the now protected data and produce data products. And so this is more my area of specialty. So we have Census Bureau has two legally mandated products that must be produced from the decennial census. The first is the apportionment population counts. Title 13 of the U.S. Code requires that these apportionment population counts for each state be delivered to the president within 9 months of census day. So that would be just by December 31st of the census year. That kicks off a series of events where the president then notifies the clerk of the House of the numbers and the number of representatives to which each state is entitled. Then the clerk needs to notify the governors of each state. The apportionment counts include both the resident population and the federally affiliated count overseas, which was mentioned in one of the earlier, when Al was talking about some of our different collection avenues. Just as a side note that I think is interesting as a District of Columbia resident, when we do apportionment, we remove the District of Columbia's population because we don't have a voting seat in the House of Representatives. So the apportionment population is not actually the population of all 50 states and the District of Columbia. It's just all 50 states. The publication of the apportionment counts and the number of seats in the House for each state is an important milestone for the next legally required product, the one that's near and dear to my heart, which is the redistricting data. By taking the resident population and dividing it by the number of seats allotted to each state, the state now knows the ideal population for creating districts of equal population once the redistricting counts are released. So they can sort of get a head start here where the resident population number is known with the release of the apportionment numbers. They'll know how many seats they get. They can then see how many people belong in each district that they have in their state, and then they can look at other data sources or estimates from before and get a general sense of how much of an upheaval is this redistricting going to be for them. The redistricting data itself has two parts, the release of data. The first being a release of geographic support products from the 2020 census, followed by release of the redistricting population counts. The geography will begin to flow to the states and the public starting in late 2020. So we'll probably start getting the geography out the door before the apportionment counts are even released. And we continue on a flow until we complete all the states. Then our legal requirement to deliver the redistricting tabulations by April 1st of 2021. We're supposed to do it within 1 year from Census Day. So we'll begin delivering that data on February 18th. In 2010, we started on February 1st or 2nd. But as I mentioned, in the previous slide in disclosure avoidance, we have to process the entire country at once. So we've had to take some things out of parallel and move them into sequence. And so we'll be starting a little later this decade. We'll be releasing probably about 8 or 9 states a week. We'll announce them through our press office, through Stephen Buckner and office, to the press and to the public about what's coming in the next week. And then we'll get those out the following week usually. Then to wrap up here with the data release schedule, we don't currently have an approved 2020 product plan. We have one that's sort of under conditional approval and it's going through that process. But so what I thought I would do is talk about what we did in some of the major products in 2010 because the timeframes seem to line up pretty much with what we're thinking for 2020 as well. We had the demographic profiles. This is these show age, sex, race, Hispanic or Latino origin, household relationship and type, group quarters population, and housing and occupancy tenure. And these are nice profiles that are all consolidated for states and cities and other areas of geography of interest. This came out in May of 2011. The summary file 1, this is the detailed table behind those profiles. It's the full breadth of information. I'm just going to speed up here because I know I'm running out of time. We want to leave time for questions. It's a large data product, and it was published over the summer of 2011, so June to August. Summary file 2 is a subset of the tables from both the redistricting and summary file 1, but we iterate them for specific races and ethnicities. These came out in December of 2011 through April of 2012. There's an urban-rural update, which is not really a product in its own right, but it's an update or refresh to the summary file 1 data, where the determinations around urban and rural designations get applied to the refresh of the SF1 product. That's important because there's a lot of federal funding streams that are tied to those characterizations. And then finally, to bring it back to my area, we produce a congressional district summary file where we retabulate summary file 1 for specific levels of geography for the new congressional districts after the census. It was the 113th census, or 113th Congress that we published in April of 2013, and we'll be working really hard to try to keep that same time frame to get the 118th Congress out after redistricting has occurred and we've collected those new plans. So just to show how everything fits in here, so capturing the data feeds into the response file, editing and imputation, count imputation goes into the unedited file, characteristic editing and imputation goes into the edited file, disclosure avoidance is a system in its own right now, and then the tabulation goes and we go to the data release. There we go. I think that I would be happy to take some questions. I'm sorry I had to rush through that a little bit. But.
So I just want to go back to the apportionment and for House seats. So what you guys give the data over to the clerk of the House who makes that call on like New York loses 2 seats, Texas gains 1, or are you the ones making that call? And just
We provide the calculation and we provide the totals and we provide them to the president. The president provides it to the clerk of the House.
so basically so you guys like you'll tell the president like New York needs to lose 2 seats and he'll tell the House that basically.
What
Or?
we'll do is we'll run the method of equal proportions, which is the congressionally mandated method for calculating apportionment, and we'll provide what the results of that calculation are, and then we'll provide that to the president.
Got it.
Oh, yeah, hi. I had 2 questions. First, on the topic of differential privacy, I remember hearing like a few months ago from the main person at the University of Minnesota, IPUMS, that one consequence of differential privacy is that the microdata from the census will no longer be as readily available to researchers. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that implication. And then second question is, do you plan with the release schedule for the summary files and profiles to also release the API data product at the same time as the tables themselves?
So I'll start with the second part first. So our current method of disseminating data now, as we put data products out on the web for dissemination, is to go through an API type structure. So our CEDSci platform, you can see it at data.census.gov, is sort of the direction that we're moving for distributing data. And in order for that tool to display that data, it typically has to come out of an API. So any new releases going forward, and we're also in the process of migrating old data products into APIs so that they can be read into the CEDSci system. As far as the differential privacy for access to the microdata, I know that there has been papers published that indicate that more of that work would have to move into the research centers, but I'm not really well versed on exactly what the implications are there.
Hi, this is Stephen. I can probably talk about it. I've been working on the differential privacy stuff quite a bit with the research and methodology area. So right when we started talking about it, some data users posed the question that we were eliminating the PUMS files, and that couldn't be more inaccurate. So no, PUMS files will still be available for use. And so that's the simple answer to that question. The ACS PUMS we're still working on, but those are still going to be available as of right now. So there have been no decisions about eliminating PUMS as suspected or as reported.
Thanks, Stephen. And also, one of the things I forgot to mention is there is a Census Scientific Advisory Committee meeting at the end of this month. And at that meeting, I believe they'll be discussing the 2020 Census Product Plan.
If the citizenship question is indeed on the census, will you guys be providing citizenship data in the redistricting file to the states, and so that they can use that if they want to?
We haven't made any decisions on the design of the 2020 file. We're currently in the process of getting out a prototype data product from the 2018 test. We just delivered the geography for that in February, late February. We're expected to deliver the tabulations for the prototype redistricting data at the end of March. And it's our process to then reach out to the states specifically as the stakeholders to see what they need for conducting their legislative redistricting, and then we'll go into a design process for the product.
So the Federal Register notice that is out right now states that if a state wants citizenship data on the redistricting file, the Census Bureau will change its processes and provide that data to them. That's what the Federal Register notice says. I can't comment on anything else, but that is the Federal Register notice that's out on the street today.
Putting on your voting rights hat, why is the citizenship question necessary to enforce voting rights?
I can speak to the, yeah.
So let me represent the views of a committee in the National Academy of Sciences that I'm part of, where our report comes to the decision that to implement the Voting Rights Act, that citizenship question is not needed on the 100% decennial census. Further, it notes that the implementation of that law in 2010 did not utilize such a question since it didn't exist, yet the implementation of the law for that 10-year period was successful in most people's minds. Do you want to add anything?
So, just in all disclosure, I was an expert witness in the New York case and in the Maryland case. So if you, rightly so, the Secretary of Commerce is given the authority in Title 13 to determine the content of the census, among other things. The Secretary of Commerce acted when the Department of Justice sent a letter to Ron Jarman, who was the acting director at the time, asking that a citizenship question be put on the census. It's been the subject of litigation. If you want to get a good understanding of it, I'd suggest you read Judge Furman's decision, where he overturned the citizenship question. But it's very, very thorough. It discusses the ins and outs, why it should be there, why it shouldn't be. And so you would get a good understanding of the issues from reading that. It's 270-some pages, so it's a long decision.